The sun had barely risen over the dry New Mexico horizon when Luke Carter, a broke cowboy with nothing left but a worn-out horse and a shack that could collapse any minute, rode toward town in search of day work. Life had been cruel to him, his cattle stolen, land nearly barren, and every neighbor he once trusted had drifted away when his luck ran out. Yet, despite all the hardship, Luke still carried one thing in abundance: kindness. That morning, as he followed a dusty trail through the canyon, he heard a faint cry echoing off the red stone walls. At first he thought it was an injured animal, but the voice was too fragile, too human. Luke dismounted, pulling aside brush and rock until he discovered a young Apache boy lying near a fallen log, barely conscious and burning with fever. His arm was swollen from what looked like a rattlesnake bite, and his breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Luke knew helping him was dangerous. Relations between settlers and Apache tribes were tense, and being caught with one of their children could mean death. Still, he couldn't walk away. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, tied it above the bite, drew out what venom he could, and lifted the boy onto his horse. All the way to his cabin, Luke whispered to him that he'd be all right, even though he wasn't sure of it himself. Once inside, Luke spent hours tending to the child, using up the last of his herbs, water, and whatever scraps of food he had left. Through the night, the boy drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking in Apache words Luke barely understood. When dawn finally broke, the fever began to ease, and the boy gripped Luke's hand with surprising strength. He whispered a name, Taza, then fell into peaceful sleep. Luke didn't know it then, but saving that child would change the course of his entire life. By midday, Luke stepped outside to gather more water, exhaustion weighing on him like a mountain, but as he stood near his well, the earth trembled beneath his boots. The hairs on the back of his neck rose as the tremor grew stronger. Hoofbeats, hundreds of them shaking the ground in a steady rhythm. Luke turned toward the horizon and his heart stopped. A vast line of riders appeared out of the shimmering heat, stretching wider than anything he had ever seen. Warriors in traditional Apache attire, spears gleaming under the harsh sun, advanced in perfect formation. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust that turned the entire plain into a golden haze. At their head rode a tall man with braids falling over his chest, his face painted in symbols of leadership and war. His presence alone radiated authority, the unmistakable Apache chief. Luke felt his hands tremble slightly. There was no doubt why they had come. He was alone, unarmed, and the boy he rescued lay asleep inside the fragile walls of his cabin. He braced himself, unsure if today would be his last. But when the chief dismounted, he did not draw a weapon. Instead, he looked Luke in the eyes, studying him with an intensity that made Luke's breath stop. Then, without a word, he lifted his hand and signaled. Instantly, 300 Apache warriors bowed their heads. Luke stared in disbelief. He'd expected revenge. But this was something else, something deeper. The chief stepped closer and spoke in a calm, powerful voice. "You saved the blood of my blood," he said. "You gave life when others would have left him to die." Behind the chief, the warriors lifted their heads, their expressions filled not with anger, but respect. For a broke cowboy who owned almost nothing, this was a moment beyond imagination. Luke didn't know what it meant yet, or what they wanted from him, but he felt a shift in the air, a destiny turning. And as the chief placed a hand over his heart in gratitude, Luke realized that even a single act of mercy could echo farther than bullets, wealth, or land. It could reach the hearts of 300 warriors, and maybe even reshape a life that had been broken for far too long. And before the chapter of this day closed, Luke had a feeling. His life was about to change in ways that would leave the entire frontier talking. The air outside Luke Carter's cabin felt impossibly still, as if even the desert wind was waiting to see what would happen next. 300 Apache warriors stood in formation, their horses silent, their eyes fixed on Luke with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Luke swallowed hard, unsure if he should speak or stay quiet. Before he could decide, the Apache chief stepped toward him again, his shadow long and commanding under the rising sun. The chief glanced toward the cabin where young Taza slept and said in a steady voice, "You risked your life for my son without knowing who he was." "That is a warrior's heart," Luke tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. He had always believed he was a failure, too broke to feed himself, too unlucky to build a future, too alone to matter. And now a chief spoke to him as if he were someone legendary. The chief then called out something in Apache, and the warriors parted to create a long path. At the end of it stood several riders holding blankets, baskets, tools, and something that glimmered like polished silver. Luke's confusion deepened as the chief gestured for him to follow. When they reached the line of gifts, the chief announced, "These are not payments. These are the offerings of a tribe, grateful beyond words." Luke stared in disbelief. The blankets were finely woven, the baskets filled with dried meat, herbs and corn. Tools he could never afford on his own gleamed in the sunlight. But what stunned him most was the beautiful, decorated saddle, something only leaders or champions would ever receive. Luke whispered, "I just did what anyone should have done." The chief smiled gently. "No," he replied. "Many men would fear us. Many would walk away. You did not." Before Luke could absorb the moment, the cabin door creaked. Taza, weak but awake, stepped out with Luke's old blanket around his shoulders. The boy saw his father and whispered a word that made the chief's eyes soften with relief. He knelt, pressing his forehead to his son's, whispering blessings Luke didn't understand but felt deeply. When the chief rose again, he faced Luke with newfound intensity. "There is more," he said, signaling once more. Two warriors brought forward a horse, larger and stronger than any Luke had ever seen. Its coat was a mesmerizing mix of deep brown and white, its mane sleek, its eyes intelligent and calm. The horse bowed slightly as if trained to greet him. The chief placed its reins in Luke's hands. "This is White Thunder," he said, "a horse of our bloodline. He will carry you with the strength of our people." Luke's chest tightened. No one had ever given him anything of such value, much less a sacred Apache horse. He lowered his head in gratitude, unsure how he'd ever repay such kindness. But destiny had more waiting for him. The chief raised a hand, and the entire formation of warriors shifted, hundreds of hooves stepping forward in perfect unison, forming a protective circle around Luke, Taza, and the chief. Dust swirled upward, glowing in the sun like golden smoke. The chief spoke so all 300 could hear. "From this day," he declared, "Luke Carter is an honored friend to our tribe. No harm shall come to him, his land, or his bloodline. If he calls, we will answer. If he stands, we stand with him." A powerful echo of approval followed. Drums of fists against shields, the rumble of hooves, and the chorus of warriors chanting in unity. Luke felt his knees weaken. Just yesterday he had gone to sleep hungry and hopeless. Today an army was vowing loyalty to him. It was unreal. As the warriors rode away in a thunder of hooves, Taza ran back to Luke, hugging him tightly. "You saved me," he whispered. "I will never forget." Luke placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't owe me anything, kid." Taza shook his head. "My tribe thinks different." By afternoon the plains were quiet again, but Luke's life was not. His home was filled with food, tools, and gifts. A magnificent warrior's horse grazed outside, and deep inside him a spark lit, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Hope. Word of what happened spread faster than wildfire. Cowboys, ranchers, townsfolk all whispered the same question. Why did 300 Apaches bow their respect to a broke cowboy? Luke didn't care about the rumors. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had purpose. He realized something powerful. Poverty hadn't defined him. Kindness had. And as the sun set behind the red cliffs, casting long shadows across the desert, Luke looked out at the horizon where the Apache warriors had disappeared. He knew this was not the end of the story, only the beginning of a bond that would reshape his destiny forever. If you want to follow the rest of this incredible journey, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and stay with us because more unbelievable stories are on the way.